Hey, excellent. I'll make a start. Great to see so many of you here today, and welcome everyone to this FWR webinar, Ecosystem Assessment using the Ramsar Convention's adopted RAWES approach, Wetlands and Beyond. This webinar today will be presented by Professor Mark Everard. Mark is visiting professor at Bournemouth University and Associate Professor of Ecosystem Services at the University of the West of England. He also works as a consultant, broadcaster, and author, working in the fields of sustainable development, systems thinking, and natural resource management and security for over 40 years across multiple developing and developed countries. Mark is Vice President of the IES, a Fellow of the Linnean Society, and is an advisor or associate with many professional, NGO, and intergovernmental bodies. He has also published 42 books and over 140 peer-reviewed scientific papers and makes frequent magazine, TV, and radio contributions. He is also a member of the FWR Water Environment and Ecosystem Services Technical Panel. As always, after Mark's presentation, there will be a chance for questions. So please do submit these in the Q&A option that you should find at the bottom of your screen. And you can do this at any point during the presentation. And these questions will later be answered by Rob McInnes. So pleased to introduce Rob as well. Rob is an independent wetland specialist and has worked in universities, NGOs, and private consultancies. He served for 13 years on the Ramsar Scientific and Technical Review Panel and is a co-author of the Ramsar Resolution 13.17 on rapidly assessing wetland ecosystem services. A massive thank you to both Mark and Rob for joining us today. And Mark, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Ethne. I'm going to speak at pace because there's a lot to cover and I'm talking to intelligent people. So I'm not going to, overdo the easy stuff, as it were. So thank you. I'm going to start by talking about systems and ecosystems, just to set some context. Systems, you buy a fishing reel, you need to know all the bits are there, they're in the right place, doing their things, working together, and if they are, then the reel functions. And who doesn't need a lot of fishing reels? If you're a medic, you know that all the bits of the body need to be there, need to be working, they need to be in the right place, they need to be interacting. See, there's no blood in that diagram, but hey, you need all the bits and they need to work together. And the same is true of the immensely complicated ecosystem of which we're part and from which we evolve. What is most commonly overlooked is that all of our activities, energy, manufacturing, food, transport, and everything else we do is part of the same socio-ecological system. Now, ecosystem services are to do with the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems, and you'll be familiar with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, or Millennium Assessment, as it was called, and this synthesis report, published in nearly 20 years ago, 2005, that introduced the 4 principal categories of provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services. You'll also be familiar with the relationships between these categories. So the provisioning services, the things we take from the system, the regulating services, things that like disease and erosion and other forms of regulation, and the cultural services are the ones we consume directly, but they are all dependent on the support, hence the name of the supporting services, which Rob always likened to the 90% of the iceberg below the surface of the sea that you don't see. If that wasn't there, you wouldn't have the visible bits of the iceberg. Equally, without supporting services, you won't have the system that produces the more directly consumed or visible benefits. But here is the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River, and it's a classic example of the way we treat ecosystems. Some bright spark decided that, well, if we dam this, then we've got piped water and we've got wired electricity, at least going to the major users and beneficiaries of it. But the damming of the river and the blocking of the processes of the river system stopped a lot of other provisioning services. Using traffic light systems here, that's something that we tend to use a lot. Green is sort of good and positive, and red is obviously the opposite. What happens to the regulating services? Well, the river basically changes regime completely. The cultural services change. We can do different recreation and tourism things, but not the things we do with the wild river. The social relations shift likewise more to an engineering type community. and the supporting services are mainly fundamentally eroded. So we have ecological degradation that drives economic degradation and social degradation, radical regime changes. A key thing about ecosystem services is they're a system. There's a reason we looked at systems to begin this presentation. We should not cherry pick the ripest cherry from the top of the bowl, because everything we do with a system has ramifications across the whole system. Take one of those washers out of the fishing reel and the fishing reel doesn't work anymore. You get the gist. And yet the way the economy treats the Earth's surface, the sea, the mineral reserves in the Earth's crust and forests is places to maximize certain provisioning services whilst fully externalizing natural beauty, ecosystem cycles, the water cycle, including quality, quantity, hydrology, hydrological regime, soil formation, including the capture and sequestration of carbon, nutrient cycling, and the regulation of climate, air quality, and other factors. These are simply not there in the way the market drives our use of ecosystems. Getting to wetlands at this wetland at Sangshan in South Korea, depending on who we are, we might see different values and want different things to be maximized from that wetland. You can see it's quite agricultural as it is. The fisherman, the artist, the engineer, the tourist, the insurance broker who might want it to be able to sell carbon credits or flood credits or whatever, the bird watcher who just wants it to be wild, the farmer who wants to yield crops. And the task of the wetland manager is immensely difficult because all of these are legitimate services, but each can undermine the rights and opportunities of all the other players on that game. Which gets us to the Ramsar Convention. What is it and why are we doing this crazy thing? The Ramsar Convention is the global convention on wetlands. It's an intergovernmental treaty for the conservation and wide use of wetlands. Why is it called Ramsar? Because it was signed in the Iranian city of Ramsar in 1971, is now signed up to by 90% of UN global members. That's 172 contracting parties as of this month. And various resolutions have been adopted over the many years, seeking more information on ecosystem services, and more latterly, the need for a robust but pragmatic assessment approach to assess ecosystem services in wetlands. The requirement has been there a long time, but very, very few ecosystem service assessments have been done, even on the premier Ramsar sites. This led to the Ramsar Resolution that was mentioned in Rob's biography there, Resolution 1317, yes, got there in the end. The Wetlands for a Sustainable Urban Future, rapidly assessing wetland ecosystem services. This is something that Rob and I wrote to be presented by the South Korean or the East Asian delegation at Ramsar COP. And it was to make tractable the art of wetland ecosystem assessment. So that was actually RAWES. That tool was RAWES, Rapid Assessment of Wetland Ecosystem Services, which didn't just drop out the sky overnight. It is to do very much with what makes a wetland assessment practical and useful above all. You can undertake a broad qualitative assessment, you can go into much more detail quantitatively, and you can go into the minutiae to monetize services. At the bottom of the pyramid, you've got broad, rapid approaches. At the top, obviously detailed ones, but massively more costly, incrementally more costly, and require more effort. And so the number of studies you're likely to see will decrease with level of detail. The question remains that even if you go to vast expense and effort, does that tell you more than the broad and rapid approach? It certainly, in virtually every case, doesn't mean more systemic, because we simply don't have the detailed data to quantify it, and certainly not to monetize most services They're very distant from the economy. So why do we need tools for wetland ecosystem service assessment? Well, as Ramsar signatories, there are commitments to assess the ecosystem service of wetlands. The fact is, most don't. We need means to assess wetlands and other habitats that are pragmatic. And for that, we need various tools. Many tools exist, actually, Invest and a number of others, but few are used and few are useful. And the reason for this is that most are non-systemic. They kind of say, well, we'll look at these services. But we're systems scientists. We know that if a missing part of the fishing reel means that the fishing reel won't work, the missing bit of the ecosystem means the ecosystem won't work. So if we pre-select and only care for part of an ecosystem, the rest may be degraded. We do this with intensive farming. We use a provisioning service output whilst trashing the carbon, the aesthetics, the habitat for wildlife, the erosion regulation, and so forth. Also, the further we go up that pyramid, we get more data intensity. And that not only makes it expensive, but also it skews our assessment to what we already have data for. So in other words, what's already in the economy or our area of concern. Monetization is problematic because money is just part of a vast spectrum of plural values. How do you fully quantify? You can represent, but how do you fully quantify an aesthetic or a spiritual value? All of these values need to be integrated, different value systems. As we go up the chain, it's more expensive, it's far from rapid, but often the outputs might say, well, this wetland is worth this $1 million. But if you're a wetland manager, what actually does that mean? Because you can't see that money in front of you. Now, when Rob and I developed the wetlands strategy for the Greater Colombo region of Sri Lanka, we pooled methods we've been using together and separately for 20 odd years to develop a rapid assessment approach that took less than 2 hours on site. It took an overview of many elements of wetlands. It integrated multiple knowledge sites. Yes, there was a degree of subjectivity, but it was low cost and resources. And above all, people actually understand it and do it. Importantly, it was systemic. It took account of all ecosystem services and the multiple value systems behind them. And with testing, it was replicable and distinctly usable. From this emerged the RAWES practitioner's guide that you see in front of you there with the web link below. I'm not going to go into this in detail because you can get it online. Rob and I wrote that for the East Asian Ramsar Regional Centre. So how do you then go about conducting a RAWES assessment? Well, here is the menu from that guide, and I'm not going to go through it in detail other than to say, well, you take a big overview, prepare well in advance for the field assessment, you conduct the assessment, and then you manage and analyze the data you obtain. What I will say, though, is many people go into an ecosystem assessment without saying, why the hell am I doing this? So the first thing is the purpose. If the purpose is for conservation, if the purpose is to do this, that, or the other, you need to be absolutely clear, because that will determine the boundaries you look at and how you begin to quantify or semi-quantify different elements of your assessment. Let's say you want to look at Tockenham Reservoir, just sort of up the hill, about 8 miles away from where I am now. You might want to say, how does the whole system work in terms of ecosystem service generation? Or you might say, I want to understand different functional units. The reservoir itself, the upstream catchment, maybe the farm that was a source of pollution, maybe the downstream end below the dam. Or your interest might be ex post. This used to be a stream, now it's a reservoir. Can we compare the different services of that regime change? You might say you want to do an ex ante study. Some bright spark might say, let's have a jet ski resort there, which would fundamentally change a lot of the ecosystem services. So what do we have now versus what might we have in future? In Gujarat at Vadvana Lake, a Ramsar site, where I was working in February, we actually use that as a training site, doing training with 70 people, which was quite a challenge to do single-handedly, but that's another matter. Are we interested in the whole lake? If so, what boundary? Is it just the wet area, or is it the surroundings? Is it the villages? So we need to be clear the question we're asking. Is it the duck farm, or is it the contribution to the wider community? Or maybe we want to compare different components of Vadvana, from the downstream areas to the open water, to the wildlife sanctuary, to the riparian zone, and so forth, to build a picture of the matrix of services and uses. Maybe we want to do that ex post study of saying what was it like before, what's it like now, how we improved or changed the balance of benefits, or maybe we want to do that ex ante. What if we turned this into a jet ski park and scared all the birds away? Well, yeah, we probably wouldn't have a Ramsar site. So we can do all of these different things and many, many more. The field assessment sheet for the RAWES assessment is fairly basic, which is a copy of it that you find in the practitioner's guide. You start off by saying, where am I? Where is it? GPS, what date is it? Who are we? And then you start looking down the ecosystem services. We're using the Millennium Assessment set here. And there's background guidance on that. And then you say, well, how important is that? And you'll see in the top left that there is a likelihood of impact score that comes from the DEFRA 2007 guide on ecosystem service assessment. You describe the benefit and then say, at what geographical range is that benefit occurring? So let's take an example of Happy Bay. There it is, done ages ago by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, a couple of weird dudes. Fresh water, interesting, not important. Why not? The evidence is it's brackish. There's no fresh water, so therefore there's no benefit. Food, there's an extensive shellfish fishery there with regional importance, so we give that a double plus. And one of the skills in the preparation, we don't have time to discuss this, is to decide the thresholds, what plus, 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 0, minus, 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 and question mark mean in the specific context when you've established the purpose. Fuel, people use driftwood for fuel locally, so we tick local, and because it's a small benefit, it's a 1+. You take your completed sheet, you put it into a digital form, an Excel form normally, so you can play games on it. There are many applications of RAWES. Here are different units of that Vadvana site that I was on in February. And here are the sheets that we did with the 70-odd people. Interesting, not a lot of disbenefits from here. You haven't got many reds. It's all double plus and plus, or nothing, or no idea there. And using traffic lights, you get a kind of sense of these different units of the wetland do different things. You can go a step further. You can transform semi-statistically the double pluses into ones, the pluses into 0.5, and you see that in front of you, and then play semi-statistical games. So here, for example, on the one of the, actually it's a site I can see out of my study window here. What is the floodplain doing in this point? Of all the relevant systems using that ESI, what we call ESI, Ecosystem Service Index transformation, there's about a 0.72 potential production of relevant services. Going to the South China Sea that Rob and I also did a report on, different habitat units, you can say, well, look, we can see visually some are more culturally important than others, some are more provisioning important. So it's just another way of presenting the data. Here, again, from the RAWES Practitioner's Guide, the provisioning services of the metropolitan wetlands of Sri Lanka, cumulatively, you can see that many are at the single plus value, some are creating disbenefit, and some are creating significant benefit. Suncheon Bay wetlands in South Korea. This is an example of where you can say, where are the benefits occurring? Are they local? Are they regional? Are they global? And you can see a distribution across a range of ecosystem services there. In the East Kolkata wetlands and the downstream wetlands of the Gangetic Delta, some work I did a few years ago with COVID, looked at 5 different sites, and these are their total ecosystem service scores, the potential maximum production of services. And you can break that down. Interestingly, Suhanyakala Island is reserved. People are not allowed there. Poachers go there, but people are not allowed. And it's there. There's a tourism industry goes there in boats and other things. So it's got a high cultural service and a high supporting services. The adjacent Gasaba Island, people live on it, they farm intensively, so the provisioning services are much higher, the cultural supporting services are lower, and so it goes. I'm just showing these very, very rapidly to give you a sense of how you can use these data. Now, Rob and I also produced an applications guide for many, many applications, and you can access that free from that download there. There's an overview of RAWES, there's Ramsar Convention applications, there's wetland management planning applications, strategic wetland planning, contributions to wider wetland reporting, and a whole host of other applications. RAWES in the real world, well, you know, whilst Rob and I developed it, we set it loose in the real world with the idea that it would be useful to people and would be taken up. So we didn't say, we'll patent this and make a ton of money and drive around in Lamborghinis, because that's not our style. And it's very reassuring that just a few days ago, a couple of weeks ago, I did a Google scholarship search on RAWES ecosystem services. We found 920 results. And in the first 50 hits, just the first 50 hits, we found real life use of RAWES in the UK, Sri Lanka, India, Ukraine, Democratic Republic of Congo, Romania, and you can read that list. So we are going global. RAWES is being used. And those applications included urban development, marshland use, floodplain use, more traditional wetlandy stuff, delta restoration, so we're into restoration as well as conservation, livelihood independence, into the worlds of carbon, the benefits of green roof, built infrastructure, and socio-cultural valuation, as well as investment opportunities. So this is a flexible system that serves many purposes and is now becoming more and more mainstream around the world, which is absolutely fantastic, because we want this baby to walk and leave home and hopefully contribute to building a more insightful, systems-informed and sustainable future. We should say that RAWES, it's a bit of a hostage to fortune putting a W in it. Rapid assessment of wetland service, because we did it independently but convergently for 20 odd years. I can show you studies in the built environment, in the Thar Desert, in the Himalayas, all of which I've published papers on, and there are many, many more. A recent one is Insure for Nature, which is an initiative of home insurance. It underpins recirculation of some of the surplus in this home insurance project into local nature products to address flood risk and contribute to nature improvement locally. This is going live next year with high quality, well-known underwriters at competitively priced. And talk to me about that, because I'm in contact with people on using RAWES to underpin that recirculation of surplus from the home insurance policy. Looking ahead, where does RAWES go next? Well, we've shown you how it is today. As we've moved on, some evolutions have emerged. And there's 2 principal ones that will be on stream, we hope, in 2025. And one is, rather than saying this service produces 2-star or 1-star or 3 minus, whatever the hell it is, benefit or disbenefit, uniformly, and then say at what scale, we're going to just change that to say provisioning services, well, the biochemicals and medicines are very important to local people for their traditions and their healthcare, kind of less so at a catchment scale, but almost vanishingly small at a global scale. So we need to reflect those differential benefits more clearly. Likewise, global climate change is always going to be 2+, if it's anything, at a global scale. And there might be some mitigation at the local scale, at the catchment scale. But generally, if I sequester a load of carbon in my garden, I'm not going to feel the benefit at my local scale. So we need to adjust that slightly. It doesn't change the DNA of rules. And another thing that we're going to do, based on what we call the Bangkok Protocol, because we cooked it up on the back of a bit of scrappy old paper in Bangkok airport about 1:30 in the morning one day, is to actually then put a logic basis for assigning scores to supporting services. Always the most difficult to score in the field. So if soil formation, the supporting services soil formation, is contributing to 2 services, climate regulation, food production, it will automatically score 2+. If it, or 2 or more, I should say. If it's contributing just 1 service, photosynthesis, oxygen generation, it's kind of benefiting local climate, but not any other service, it will get a plus. And if the nutrient cycling isn't actually linked to a service for which there are clear beneficiaries, then you can't say that it is supporting one of the consumed outputs of the wetland or the ecosystem. Take-home messages, because we're coming up to the end of my bit. My stuck record, anyone who talks to me is being blue in the face, talking about systems, 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 and more systems. We don't do systems the way we run this world. We absolutely have to, if we stand any chance of having a sustainable future. Everything we do has systemic implications for the socio-ecological system with feedbacks, and so that needs to reshape everything that we do and think. Key features of RAWES are that it's rapid, that's the R, it's affordable and it's intuitive. People in the institution of the real world can actually use it, and that matters, because if you have something that is wonderful and whizzy and unusable, it won't get used. It is systemic. We look at the whole system. We are systems thinkers. We've established that in the first slides, and yet we don't generally do systems application and thinking. It's evidence-based. Every assertion has to be based by clearly stated and recorded evidence, but significantly integrated in multiple forms of knowledge and value systems. It's semi-quantitative. Likelihood of impact scores integrate the different knowledges and give them weights, and we can play games with those weights, as we saw. It is replicable. Certainly in Sri Lanka, we had different teams going to the same places, and we found that it was highly replicable, which is a reassurance. It has many applications. Some are in the Ramsar Regional Centre, East Africa applications guide, the link to which is in a prior slide. But also just look at the wider literature, all the ways it's been used, the Himalayas, the Thar Desert, mangrove systems, built development, and many, many more, including the new insurance product. And it's not just wetlands. We produced RAWES for Ramsar, but I mean, originally I dreamed up a wonderful acronym about the functional assessment of conservation of ecosystem services, but somehow the acronym FECES didn't seem to be ideal. So we've ended up with RAWES. But it's not just wetlands. This is an approach that we've used over many years, has many applications and a long history pre-Ramsar. So that's it. You've heard enough from me, and Rob is going to field the questions from now on.
Thank you very much, Mark. There have been a few questions popped into the question and answer box. So the first one was saying, really thinking about the Ramsar Convention and putting some of this work in the context of that. Ramsar, in theory, because it's an international intergovernmental treaty, should work universally across every single country across the world that's a signatory. So all 172 countries should have the same amount of input and support and implementation. Sadly, that isn't the case. There's been a whole range of assessments that have been done looking at implementation of the convention, and what we find is it's not universal. Certain countries are better at implementing their commitments and their requirements and their obligations, and certain countries are very poor. There's no clear picture that emerges on why. Sometimes it's down to resources, finances. Quite often it's political and down to governmental will. Part of the work which myself and some colleagues did prior to developing the RAWES approach and prior to sort of drafting the resolution, we just looked at an assessment in terms of ecosystem services across different countries. And what we were finding that for instance, in North America, there was pretty good uptake of people assessing ecosystem services, about 66% of the countries. But when you look to Africa, it was less than a quarter of the countries were actually assessing ecosystem services. And that's a bit of an insight into the fact that the implementation of the convention is not universal. There's a couple of questions about really looking at RAWES in terms of, can it be used in other environments? Can it be used in multiple sort of environments, even different wetland environments? And I think Mark has hammered home that question, or the answer anyway. With regards to wetlands, we've undertaken, and others have undertaken, as Mark said, there's been publications of wetlands which are ephemeral, which are permanent, high altitude, coastal, marine, inland, freshwater, saline, you name it. It works across all wetland types. In terms of application to other types of systems, so maybe terrestrial forests, grasslands, savanna, etc., absolutely, the logic underpinning it would work, but I think there would be some tweaking needed of the guidance and the sort of issues and questions you have to ask yourself as an assessor to link what's going on in the natural system to what's going on in human systems. So absolutely it can be applied, but I think there would need to be a little bit more tweaking of some of the actual guidance. There's a question just popped up on the quasi-qualitative analysis of ecosystem services across East Calcutta. Basically, can we elaborate on the methodology used and the approach to assess and compare ecosystem services? Mark, do you want to take that, or I'm happy to carry on with that one?
I can put your name there. I'll send you the paper. This is the quickest way. But basically, yeah, it was a team assessment in 3 different areas and a collation of views. And it's important that you do approach this as a team, because when Rob and I, for example, were in the Colombo catchment, we went to what looked like a standard rice paddy, and we spoke to someone. He said, no, this is linked to the temple, and this is all native strains, and this is all harvested to the Buddhist calendar. So suddenly you've got these spiritual and cultural importances that we didn't see as white dude experts. So yeah, working as a team matters. It doesn't quite answer the question, but I got enthusiastic. Sorry about that.
And again, I think I would refer people to one of the publications that Mark mentioned. There's an applications guide, which is published on the Ramsar Regional Centre East Asia's website. Very easy to find under, if you Google RRCEA publications. And that goes through different ways you can use the methodology to account for those diverse systems. So you are comparing like with like rather than potentially comparing sort of apples and oranges. So hopefully that answers the question. I think that's the only questions we've had.
Amazing.
So,
Well,
pass back to Ethne.
thank you so much, Rob and Mark. That was a really interesting overview of RAWES and how it can be used. So thank you so much for presenting and answering those questions. I wonder if I could just throw in one final question before we wrap up today, which is, you mentioned, Mark, in terms of how the tool is kind of changing and evolving. One of the things is if there's something that kind of leads to 2 ecosystem services, then it will get more kind of weighting than something that only leads to 1. Within the different ecosystem services that you talk about, are they all kind of treated as equally within that, or can you weight them in different ways depending on what you're looking at, or how does it work when you're looking at all of those different services?
Well, in preparing to do an ecosystem service assessment, you need to, as I said, purpose purpose. Now, if you're looking at a huge, great wetland, then you might say 2 pluses has to be over 250,000 people. If you're looking at a tiny one, it might be half a dozen, you know, in a tribe. So that's all part of the preparation of working out where your thresholds are. But when it comes to the supporting services, which is where that refinement will come in, instead of sort of saying, well, you know, is it producing habitat for wildlife? Is it doing nutrient cycling? You actually sort of say, you don't really ask the question at all. The question is automated in the sense that if the nutrient cycling is contributing to food production and physicochemical purification of water, it's doing 2 jobs, and therefore it automatically goes to 2+ significance because it is serving multiple purposes. If no one is consuming the services that the Habitat for Wildlife is supporting, then there is not a service to be recorded, because go back to the definition, ecosystem services are benefits to people. There has to be a visible beneficiary or group of beneficiaries to score.
And if I can just come in on that, I think one of the errors that people make when looking at ecosystem services using the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment construct is people say, oh yes, supporting services are really important, they're there, but if they're not supporting another service, they're not a supporting service. But equally, what's really critical is that isn't to say that for the intrinsic value of that system, the way that system is functioning, with humans being outside of the equation, that supporting function rather than service is critical to maintain a system. It's just that humans aren't reaping a benefit from it. So it's not saying that the nutrient cycling in a wetland isn't important. It's saying it's not important in terms of supporting a benefit to humans. So it doesn't pick up necessarily on some of those more intrinsic values, which are much harder to sort of assess, but it does pick up on the ecosystem service values.
If you define your purpose as what's the potential exploitation of the wetland or the ecosystem, then it is going to be positive, even if no one's consuming it now, because that is your purpose. What could it do, rather than how is it being exploited now or used or in the current.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was really interesting, really useful to hear all of the answers to those questions. And again, thanks to Mark and Rob for spending the time to get involved. And thank you to all of our attendees today for logging in and joining us. I hope you all found that as useful as I did. And if you are an IES member, you can record your attendance at this webinar using the IES CPD tool, which you can access by logging into the members area of our website. This webinar has been recorded, and as usual, it will be made available on our YouTube channel. If you are watching the recording on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel, like the video, and hit the bell to gain notifications of new content. Our next FWR webinar is taking place on the 24th of October, and this will be on integrated water management and economic growth. Please do register for this. You can do so on our website and on the FWR website. Once again, thank you to our speakers, Mark and Rob, and to all of you for attending. Have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.